Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Heather Morse. I am the Specialty Ag Editorial Director. Today's webinar, Rooted in Recovery, Post-Harvest and Early Season Fertility for Nut Trees, is brought to you by ICL Growing Solutions. I'm happy to introduce our guests today. We have Christy Fallon, ICL Western Agronomy Technical Services Manager, Dr. Richard Harima, Extension Pecan and Pistachio Specialist at New Mexico State University, and Derek Davidson, ICL Technical Sales Manager, Desert Southwest. This webinar is eligible for 1 CEU credit, and after the presentation, there will be a QR code to scan with your CCA app on your mobile device. If you don't have the app, we suggest you download it now. Today, we will dive into a systems-based approach to post-harvest and early spring nutrition for pistachios, almonds, and pecans, covering recovery, root flush, and nutrient storage. We'll discuss practical strategies to improve nutrient use efficiency, support tree health, and set your orchard up for strong yields and quality in the year ahead. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many of those questions as we can. And now I am happy to welcome our guests, Christy, Richard, and Derek.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Carolyn, I'm going to have you go ahead and go to the next one. So today, as we start thinking about, finances, I think that's the top of everyone's mind. So what can we do to alleviate some of the financial concerns or pressures? But we look at it from the standpoint of the agronomic and the nutrient choices that we can do that will help us, whether we're looking at post-harvest or dormant or early season applications, depending on the nut orchard. And then how can we fill some of those nutrient gaps? What goals can we look at and priorities that we'll focus on? But really, we want to offer some solutions and get to the key of the agronomics so that we can influence the financial or the economics for the growers. So we're not only talking about the post-harvest fertility in almonds, for example, that falls into play, but it could also be on pecans, for example, that they need to look at a combination of what they're doing during the season before harvest and also early in the spring. So let's delve into it a little bit more and go to the next slide and start thinking about the different pieces to the puzzle.
So what's happening in the tree after harvest or even early in the season? And why is this window so critical for that year and future production?
Yeah, that's a great question to think about, Derek, as we think about what we need to do in the fall. We think about almonds in particular. If we have some opportunities to be able to look at the root flush and set it up for the new roots that are coming so we can take up nutrients, how can we replenish those? How can we store the carbohydrates? If we don't have adequate nutrition in the fall or the early spring, then we're not going to have good bud set and differentiation. So then, of course, that equates to yield potential and quality from that standpoint. And also the stress recovery. It's a lot of stress on the almonds with all of or any of the other nut orchards. So what can we do? Can we do it from a fertigation standpoint? Or do we have the opportunity to do foliars as well? Do we do some dry granular fertilizer? What options can we do to be able to maximize the stress recovery and its potential for the future? Next. So if we think about what's the status of the orchard, what's been the yield potential thus far, the example that you look at here with the nonpareils and almonds say that we did have a leaf tissue analysis that was deficient for nitrogen in July. There is a higher yield potential that's coming with that variety. And so, and it's an early harvest, and we still have plenty enough fertility timing to take it up. We have healthy enough tissue that it can take it up. Then we would look at applying that nitrogen a smaller amount, let's say, up to 20%, or maybe a little bit less that we would do in the fall time or post-harvest. If the tree, for example, is stressed and has had senescences going on, it's a later harvesting variety, or pecans that may be harvested later in the season, then, if we don't have the tissue and the tree status to take it up, then there's no point in doing that because it's not going to be taken up into the tree. Next. So if we start delving into a little bit more of the other nutrients that we can look at, the P and the K and the zinc, we know are super critical from the standpoint of root flushes, stored energy, the ADP, the ATP. To look at how important the potassium is and how much demand is needed by the different nut orchards, especially in almonds. We know that we have to have it for water balance, for enzymatic activities, and being able to have the metabolic processes. So photosynthesis even. So really important that we have from that standpoint, the potassium is just super critical across all the nut orchards. So there's a lot of different solutions that you can pick from. There's some of the products listed here on the right side that we may consider if you're looking for being able to increase your nutrient use efficiency. The PEC acid or the Agrolution pH low products are more acidifying. So those would be good if you have a higher pH or you're after the nutrient use efficiency. The BIOS Diamond is a product that we've started utilizing that we've seen even more enhanced nutrient efficiency. So then that helps with the economics as we put something on, helps with the economics and the agronomics. A lot of other choices you see here. We're not going to go into all the details of those. We'd be welcome to discuss options with you afterwards and ask more questions. But, really focusing in on the key things that we need to do, thinking about doing if we need that zinc, be able to put on like a zinc extra or other sources of zinc that Dr. Hirma will talk with you about. And then there are extra products that we utilize either on a foliar basis. Some of them can be put on from a fertigation as well. And then a key thing that we'll talk about for potassium and calcium, sulfur, magnesium would be polysulphate. And if you're after amino acids, fulvic acid, plant extracts, all of the extra products do include those. And the BIOS Diamond is not registered in every state, but it's certainly an excellent tool to utilize in all the states that it is registered. We're continuing to pursue registration in all the states. It's helped us with enhanced nutrient efficiency, root growth, food for the microbes, and soil enzyme activation. Next. We know that boron is super critical for flowering overall, and so then for nut production across all the orchards. We have in California opportunities and on the West Coast where we have the pleasure of having both deficient and toxic levels of boron. We can balance it and get it on at the proficiency, nut set, flowering, and so on. And then if you look at the zinc side, from that standpoint, we know how critical it is for that root growth, stress recovery, and bud differentiation. And we already mentioned those others there at the bottom. So let's go to the next one. Carolyn, can you go? There we go. All right, so then you think about micronutrients, and we know how super critical that those are. So when we have nickel, molybdenum, and cobalt, those are actually products that are in Nova Elevate, Nova Pulse. So when we have the nickel, we know that it is necessary along with the moly because the nickel's required by the urease enzyme. The moly is a cofactor for nitrate reductase and the conversion of nitrate to nitrite and then to ammonium. So even though we need a small amount, we need to make sure that we have those there. If we have cobalt in the mix, then we can reduce the ethylene production and we can delay fluorescence, so then we can have more nuts. So again, do we have the leaf tissue in the fall to put those on? Or otherwise, we're looking at early spring that we would be looking at those applications. And then depending on the variety, we may have to do them multiple times. Okay. Next.
So, how do you identify nutrient gaps during the season and prior to harvest, so that they can be corrected for the next year?
All right, so this is where I'll start talking about kind of the different approaches to determining where you sit in your orchard with your mineral nutrition program. So there's a lot of different things that we can be looking at. So I'm gonna start first by the visual signs. So as you can see, the sampling strategies or approaches for assessing your nutrition status. Visual signs is getting familiar with what the nutrient deficiency symptoms what they look like. What does a healthy plant look like? What does a deficient plant look like? And it's more than that. Sometimes it's imbalances between different nutrients and or toxicities that also can appear. Become familiar with that. They're unique to different species of plants. So almonds, it's going to be different than pecan. It's going to be different from pistachio, but there's some similarities as well. Become familiar. Now, the problem with the visual signs is there's actually two problems. One is by the time you see a symptom, if there's a symptom of a deficiency or toxicity, there's already damage done. And so ideally, we want to catch that before any symptoms show up. But if the symptoms show up, we won't be able to target it and deal with it, handle it. There's another problem with it, and that is sometimes deficiencies are they're causing economic harm, but you can't see it yet. It's not that bad yet. So we'd call that hidden hunger in the case of a deficiency. You can have the same thing with toxicities where it's affecting yield, it's affecting production, it's affecting plant health. You just can't see anything yet. What about soil? So we'll go to the first one there. So soil sampling is critical to the whole process. It is critical, but it doesn't tell you everything. When we sample, we are sampling just a tiny little piece of the soil, and with a tree, it's only a tiny fraction of what that root zone is being exposed to. So you're not getting the whole picture of the variability. You're not getting the picture of the exact status of the plant. But what it can tell us is why we are seeing a problem. For example, we may be able to see that the pH is high. We may be able to see that the lime content is high. We may be able to see that the nutrient levels are low. There's a lot of different factors that may explain why we are seeing a problem, and we won't get that unless we do regular soil sampling. My recommendation is that happen at least once per year, preferably I would say during the winter time when there's less variability. That at least one time it happened then, and perhaps more than one time during the season. Then there's tissue analyses. In the case of pecan, we would sample leaflet tissues, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. What I would say is, depending on what species what species of tree nut you're growing, become familiar with what the recommended sampling protocol is for that crop, so you know what type of tissue and when to sample. Next slide, please. All right, so we'll get to that when to sample part just in a moment, but before we get into that, one thing that's important for knowing the rates of application of nutrients is getting a sense of how much of the crop or how much nutrient is the crop removing in a particular year. Now, this is a very generalized sort of a figure that shows like what the ratios are in plant tissue in general. And this might give you something of a sense of what nutrients are required in the largest amount. So as you can see, nitrogen's the largest, and so all the nutrients that you're seeing on the left circle, the left pie, those we would normally call the macronutrients that are required by the plant in the largest quantities. We normally would measure those in percentage by dry weight on plant tissue. Whereas the other ones, they make up that tiny little fraction. Those micronutrients make up a tiny fraction of the total nutrient weight, but they're so critical. They're so critical because they're involved in the function of these enzymes. They're involved in a lot of the processes that Christy mentioned earlier. They're small in amount, um, but they're very critical, and they're often deficient, particularly in situations like we have in New Mexico, where the soil pH is above 7. Next slide, please. All right, so going back to one of the things I mentioned earlier is the timing of leaf tissue sampling or leaflet tissue sampling is really important. Now, for pecan, we typically would recommend doing your standard leaf sample in late July or August. And so part of the reason we do that is because we want to target a period when there's not rapid change in leaf tissue concentration of most of the nutrients. What you see on this slide is the pattern of leaf tissue nutrient concentration over time for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and some of the other nutrients. And what you see there is the little happy face that you see on it. That's actually the targeted tissue concentration. So on the pecan trees that you're seeing these data from, they were deficient at the time for many of the nutrients. So for example, nitrogen in late July, early August, you can see that it was only about 2.2%. We would be targeting 2.5%. And you can see the same thing for phosphorus and potassium. But what I want you to notice is for nitrogen and phosphorus, a little bit less for potassium, is you see this leveling out of the nutrient concentration during that middle part of the season. That is the reason we want to target that time period for sampling. And that is the time period for which all of the nutrient recommendation charts are based. Can we sample in May? Can we sample in June? Yes, you can, but don't use the recommended levels that are published to evaluate whether it's deficient or not. Rather, in that instance, you really need to base your sampling off of one where you know it's okay. So you're sampling from a healthy orchard as well as one where you suspect there might be a nutrient imbalance, a nutrient problem. And so you need to sample those side by side. Don't use the published literature for those. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're talking about how much nutrient is removed by the crop itself. Okay, so these are some calculations that were done by Dr. Walworth. He's retired from University of Arizona, but just to give you a sense of, for every 100 pound of in-shell pecans that come out of an orchard, this is what you might expect to be removed for that particular nutrient. That doesn't necessarily give you the full picture of what is leaving the orchard. There's other ways. For example, nitrogen can be leached if you think that you're losing some that way. There's also volatilization. There's other inefficiencies. But we do know that this much is being lost by the crop. It just went at harvest. Okay, and so that gives you a sense for pecans. Again, you need to become familiar with what that might be for your particular crop if you're growing other nut crops. Next.
So what does a grower risk by skipping post-harvest or early season, early spring fertility in their orchards?
All right, so there's actually several things that the plant is being set up for at that point. So remember, in the case of pecan is pecans are typically harvested. Most of our most common varieties are harvested in November. The plant's already dormant, so that's a little bit of a different scenario for pecan than it would be for almond, where you have an extended period after harvest where the crop is, as was mentioned earlier, recovering from producing producing the crop itself, as well as whatever environmental stresses might have existed during the season. In the case of pecan, that late season period, though, it actually coincides. You have both preparation for winter and you have kernel fill. The most important stage of the crop from an economic perspective is happening. It's coinciding with preparation for winter, and so that late season really is important. So, for example, nitrogen is a really good example of one where there's a high nitrogen demand by the kernel. If your leaf tissue sample says that you're deficient for nitrogen in August, then we know that we need to supply additional nitrogen during that late period to both set the plant up for the winter time and make sure that there's enough nitrogen to get into those kernels and actually get good high quality nut production. Um, Also, if a plant goes into dormancy, and this is particularly the case for pecan because of that late ripening, that it can set it up for the following season. Poor flower quality, poor flower number might all be affected by the nutrition going into dormancy. Okay, we have also one option is to actually deal with some of these nutrients in the springtime. Some of these we want to make sure that it's, for example, the nitrogen and potassium, phosphorus, we want the plant to go into dormancy with sufficient. Some of these like nickel, so one of the micronutrients, that typically, and a lot of the micronutrients, this is the case. If the plant goes into dormancy deficient, sometimes that can create a huge issue if it's not dealt with in the springtime. And nickel's a really good example of that, where you may see very poor leaf development, unusually shaped leaves, mouse-eared leaves, if it's not handled in the springtime. And sometimes a fall application might be beneficial as well. Next slide, please. I think this one was going to be handled by Christy. Is that correct?
I can do it quick and then you can just chime in for anything else. I think that, we covered some of these earlier on, but a key piece to the puzzle is really making sure that we think about having the nitrogen to sulfur ratio to the nitrogen to potassium ratio in balance if we want to be able to have better nutrient use efficiency. And then, we just mentioned some of them, the micronutrients and how important that they are. Can see the different pieces to the puzzle of how critical that they are as well. And then the calcium and the magnesium and having them in relationship to each other is important. And then as we think about having, those you look at Richard's slide, they were more on the macronutrient side. Having them in balance with each other and having good cations in the soil is definitely important as well. And then I'll let you go to the next one, Richard, and
All
cover
right.
it.
What I'm going to do at this point is do a bit of an overview of a few of the studies that we've done on zinc nutrition. I mentioned earlier that becoming aware of what the nutrient deficiency symptoms and imbalance symptoms look like. We're gonna look at a few photos and see what zinc deficiency symptoms look like in pecan. Again, if you're growing almonds or pistachios or another nut crop, the symptoms might be a bit different. What you see on this slide is classic um, a classic sort of a rosette type symptom that you would see from severe zinc deficiency symptoms. And what you see here is small leaves. The name of that symptom is little leaf, and you'll also see some crinkling of the leaves, um, you'll see that telescoping of the internodes, so that they're all the nodes are very close to each other, giving that bunchy sort of appearance. Next slide. This is what it might look like, where you see leaves that are sufficient and deficient on the same plant, very common with some of these micronutrients. Next slide. And then this sort of interveinal chlorosis and necrosis, giving that kind of that fishbone sort of a pattern. Next slide. And you can see in this case, the nut cluster was affected. So the deficiency symptom on this shoot was so severe that the nuts actually aborted, right? They're not going to actually grow. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about one of the reasons why zinc deficiency is such a difficult thing in nut crops, and in pecan in particular. So pecan is native to areas where the soils have readily available zinc. And that's because most of the native region has acidic soils where the pH is below 7. Um, a lot of the places where we now grow pecans, like in New Mexico, we have alkaline soils that are high in calcium carbonate, high in lime. And under those conditions, there may be plenty of zinc in the soil. It's just simply not available for uptake by the plant. That creates a really difficult situation for delivering nutrients. Now we have one option that's foliar nutrient, and it's almost cheating, you might say. It's avoiding contact of the nutrient with the soil so that you don't deal with that reduced availability under the high pH conditions. But that comes with some problems as well. So here, what you see here is this is from a master's thesis from 1970. Wadsworth was the name of the student who did this work at Texas A&M. And what he did is he delivered a zinc isotope that's radioactive as a little drop to the leaf. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but that black area on the right image, okay, so the right image, you see a seed. This is a seedling pecan tree where he just put a drop right at the base of one of the leaflets and then gave it a little bit of time and looked at where the nutrient went. Okay, and what you see there is that the nutrient didn't really move very far away from that little droplet that he applied to the leaflet. Okay, it just didn't move much. Basically, what this shows is that zinc is more or less immobile in pecan. Okay, so the phloem mobility is very limited. On the left image, what you see is zinc is applied to these are potted plants. He applied it to the roots, to the pot. Okay, and this what they did not have the high pH soil, the alkaline conditions. And what you see is that radioactive zinc, all that dark color, it's in the roots, it's in the stems, and it's in the leaves. It's everywhere in the whole plant. Okay, so what you see is the very different situation between root application of this nutrient and foliar application of the nutrient. You don't run into that immobility problem with that phloem immobility problem when it's applied to the root. Okay. So now think about what's going on here. That means that in a pecan tree where we're applying zinc fertilizer, if we don't hit all of the leaves, if we don't get good coverage with that air blast sprayer, we're going to be dealing with zinc deficiencies in the parts of the canopy that don't get hit with the nutrient. That's of course an issue in a tree with a tree the size of a pecan, and also when you're living in a place where it's windy a lot of the time and the humidity is really low, that's a real concern. But we can't really very easily apply it to the soil either, because of our soil, at least when we're applying zinc sulfate, and that's what was done in the particular experiment that you see here. Next slide, please. So we did a study, and I did this in collaboration with Jim Walworth. We did a study where we tested the use of chelated zinc products when applied to the soil in Arizona. Again, these are alkaline and calcareous soils where zinc should not be available. The accepted dogma was that even a chelated zinc is not going to be really adequate for pecans in the West. We used 2 cultivars, Wichita and Western, and we applied the zinc over a whole growing season. Next slide, please. All right, so again, the accepted dogma before this time was that even chelated fertilizers are of little use under these conditions. And what you see from our data right here, this is the leaf zinc concentrations of the 3 different treatments. The 3 treatments were 0 pounds per acre or kilograms per hectare. It's going to be the same for pounds per acre, kilograms per hectare is going to be kind of the same. There's 0 for our control. That's the black bars. You see 2.2 kilograms per hectare, which is the middle bar on each year, and then 4.4 kilograms per hectare. That's our high rate, and what you see that's the right bar for each year. Well, what you see there is significant differences between the treated, especially at the high rate, the treated and the untreated. What does that tell us? That tells us that that dogma was wrong. It tells us that you can apply a chelated material to the soil, at least this chelated material, zinc EDTA, we haven't tested others yet, that it does get into the plant. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we also, well, so we know that it gets into the plant, but is it enough to deal with the deficiencies? Um, if you looked at the data we just looked at, actually the concentration of our highest application rate, it didn't reach what we would expect for zinc applied foliarly. Okay, it didn't really meet our target of 50 parts per million. But is it enough to deal with the deficiency symptoms? Let's look at deficiency symptoms. We used a rating system where 5 means no symptoms and 1 means severe symptoms of zinc deficiency. And what you saw in 2012, 2013, and 2014, that there were severe deficiency symptoms. If you look at 2014 data, for example, there was a rating of about 3. So that's pretty bad symptoms in the ones where there's no treatment. This is especially true for the Wichita trees. But you can see that almost a rating of 5 was, even for our low zinc application rate, that means no zinc deficiency symptoms. Okay, but remember, symptoms are not the be all end all. What about tree function? So next slide, please. Before I get into the actual tree function, something really interesting happened too, and that is that we could see that the zinc was getting into the other tissues, right? The root tissue has a zinc requirement too. We're actually getting it into the root. We're getting it into the shoot. It has a zinc requirement, and even the kernel, it has a zinc requirement, and we're getting it into the kernel as well. Just like what we saw in the Wadsworth thesis data, right? It's getting everywhere in the plant. Next slide. And there's a picture of the low rate, the 2 pounds or 2.2 kilograms per hectare treatment on the left, and the 0 pounds per acre or 0 kilograms per hectare zinc on the right. You see huge differences in growth. Next slide. All right, but what about this is symptoms again. Now you see that that the SPAD, that's basically greenness. Some of you have probably used a SPAD meter before. How green is that leaf? You're seeing that the symptoms are dropping off at about 20, a little bit more closer to 15 parts per million. That's where you're starting to see the symptoms show up. That's a lot lower than the 50 parts per million that we would have been targeting previously. So you see how that right below that 15, that's where the greenness starts to decline. Next slide, please. Okay. Now here's where tree function. Now I consider this to be sort of the gold standard for a physiology measurement. I think from a horticulture perspective, we'd be interested in yield as well. So we already looked at tree growth. There's a difference there. But what about yield? But let's look at photosynthesis first. You see almost the same pattern that we saw on the last slide, and that is where the greenness started to drop off. Again, for both years, for 2013 and 2014, at approximately 15 parts per million of zinc, we saw it starting to drop off. And what this tells us is that our zinc applications, because the ones that applied where we applied 2 pounds or 4 pounds, those were above that 15 parts per million. That's where we see that. Right at that point is where the deficiencies start showing up when we look at the physiology of the plant, not just the visible symptoms. Next slide, please. What about, so we did a separate experiment. The next question was, well, what is it actually, how does it compare to foliar applications? And so we had an orchard where these were mature trees. We applied zinc to the soil, just like you saw in the last experiment. But we also applied additional zinc foliarly to it. Okay, so again, this is zinc EDTA. We don't know what other chelates would do. And what you see in this is that you see all those A's. That means there's no statistical significantly different results here. The photosynthesis was unaffected by adding more zinc foliarly. That tells you that we are actually getting the zinc level um, all the way up to where it needs to be. We're not adding any more zinc in order to affect photosynthesis. Okay, so that's the point of this. Additional foliar didn't improve the photosynthesis. Next slide, please. All right, so that's the bottom line here. Now I should mention I didn't show you the data here. The yields were also significantly higher for the soil applied zinc. In the study where we did the soil applied zinc on immature trees, we saw increased yield by the end of the study as well when it came to soil applied zinc versus the untreated control. These are the collaborators and the funding sources. So, all right.
So as we move along, what are the key post-harvest to spring goals for almond, pistachio, walnut, and pecan orchards? What are some shared goals and what are some key differences between the different nut crops?
Yeah, so let's look at a few of them. We'll start with the shared goals and think about, overall we have to do the nutrients, we have to build the roots, we have to look at tree health, nut quality, yield, and pH has been mentioned, but there are some differences in just in timing and what type of irrigation, what type of soil pH. So let's go to the next slides and we're going to cover several of them that will help us as we start thinking about that overall for our shared goals. It's really root health. We talked about root flush and being able to increase our nutrient use efficiency, because as we do that, that allows us to be able to have those strong economics and strong agronomics and tree health. So it's a win-win on all fronts. And as we've mentioned, we start thinking about not only this year and the recovery for this year, but setting it up for next year with making sure that we have the appropriate nutrition for nut set, for kernel size, for sustained release of calcium and potassium, and overall better yield and quality. So that doesn't matter. We do it across all orchards. We're looking for that. So next slide. So a key piece to the puzzle that we can utilize for nut orchards and everything is looking at that baseline of the agronomics that come into play with the polysulphate. Whether you're looking at it from a post-harvest, dormant season, early season fertility, it will actually fit all of those from a nut orchard perspective. So let's quickly go through some of the details of some of the results, and I'll hit some highlights for you. Next slide. So polysulphate is a natural mineral. It actually is commercially utilized for most commercial agriculture production on the whole, but it is actually organic certified as well. So it can be utilized for both aspects. It has a sulfur content of 19, potassium at 14, magnesium at 3.6, and calcium at 12.2. So all super critical as far as nutrient functions. It has a low salt content, and it actually is a gradual release. Let's go to the next slide. That allows us to be able, with that gradual release, to be able to be taken up as there's moisture and it's released into the root zone, then it's taken up by the plant in a much higher concentration than other fertilizers. We have less that is leached and more that is left in the soil for some residual benefit. So we actually can have economic, agronomic, and environmental benefits that could come into play with it. Next slide. So here I want you to look at how some of the agronomics and the gradual release can help with the polysulphate granule. You see it's that third line down, applied during dormant period, springtime. You compare it to the first line, which is a grower standard practice of 300 pounds to the acre of sulfate of potash in the fall. And you can see that we statistically increased the yield as far as the nut per acre. But we also had, even at $1.42 a pound, we had a gross return to the grower of $648 over the grower standard. So we go to the next slide. And we see that at $2 a pound, where there was good economics in the prices, we were at $912 per acre as far as a comparison there. So whether we're at a lower rate on the price per pound or a higher rate, we were seeing an economic return to the grower. Next slide. Okay, so then if we think about it from the context of the nutrient use efficiency and being able to not have as much left in the soil, as the case here with the grower standard of the 300 pounds of the sulfate of potash, you can see that there is actually a higher concentration in the spring of the potassium, and then also higher in the fall in August compared to line 3 with the granular polysulphate. So you'd say, okay, well, what is the tree actually telling you? You look at the levels in the tree, and it was actually high in the spring with a granular polysulphate, and that corresponded to a higher economic yield. The leaf tissue had dropped off in the fall, so again, have to make sure that it's available at the right timing. A beauty of the granular polysulphate is its gradual release and it being taken up with its potassium, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium all in a good ratio, really being able to add cations back to the soil, being able to add those critical nutrients for the nut growth, whatever nut orchard that we're talking about. Let's keep going to the next slide. We saw pistachios, an increase in yield, an increase in the split per shell. Next slide. And then we also saw a reduction in blank nuts and an increase in the dry weight. So not only yield, but quality perspective. This is comparing 725 pounds to the acre of polysulphate compared to a ton of gypsum. Next slide. If we think about it in the context of, this one was in Georgia, and thinking about pecans, from one year to the other, thinking about, do we have an increase in the nut yield? And you can see that in 2024, there was more of an increase in the nut yield. The other thing to mention here is this is the grower standard fertilizer of 285 pounds to the acre of a 3014 plus the polysulphate. So the polysulphate was added for the sulfur content. Next slide. And you see here that it's not just about the yield piece, it's about the edible, the yield as far as the nut pound per acre. Here, the edible nut meat increased, and it also had the price per pound increase. So the gross revenue averaged 228 pounds per or $228 per acre. But if you look at the net and thinking about the return on investment, it was either a 2.3 to 1 ROI or a 4.8 to 1 net. So it definitely was a benefit there as an add-on for the sulfur content. Next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of differences, a lot of them related to how we would apply based on different irrigations, different harvest windows. Again, mentioned using an acidifying fertilizer like our Novapec acid or our Agrolution pH low to increase the nutrient use efficiency in the soil. And I'm gonna keep going here and try and go to the next slides and have Derek actually cover some of the pecans.
Yeah, so we're gonna in these next couple slides, we'll focus mostly on pecans in the desert Southwest. That's what I know. And there's some practices, some specific practices to us, but the general agronomic concepts could be adapted across all the growing regions and even to other nuts. And we'll also kind of look at more of an in-season play with this rather than just the early and late season, but we will start with early season with that pre-root flush application. So trying to feed the soil before we see bud break and get nutrients ahead of that root flush. So look at polysulphate, like Christy was just mentioning. We could look at PK plus as well. Add in some phos for the polysulphate. Humics are a great option to apply ahead of the season for the soil benefit, as is Bio's Diamond. We're registered. Those two in combination would be really good. Look at Zinc Extra. Get some fulvic, amino, and some plant extracts out there, or some other soil applied zinc. That could be a dry zinc as well, or an EDTA or a ligno zinc. Trying to get that in the soil before that first root flush. In early sprays, we know some of the other nutrients to focus on, some zinc and manganese. But look at also doing some moly, cobalt, and nickel in those first couple sprays using an Nova Elevate, or Nova Pulse. Really help with some nitrogen efficiency, some flowering things, and some enzymatic activity. In season and late summer, these are going to be more high potassium times. So you can even get some from Nova Pec Acid, High Peak, Finish, Uptake K, Nova NK. There's so many options for in-season fertility, focusing on potassium for quality water balance. Even looking at a K-style product with some salicylic acid to help additional help with heat and drought tolerance, salinity tolerance, even some biotic stresses from certain insects. And getting back to kind of the premise of this whole thing, some late season nutrition here. Again, high potassium, support husk opening and ripening. Try to put the trees to bed with that, and hopefully with that husk opening, hope try to reduce some vivipary that I know is common in some regions. Kind of looking at a strategic season-long plan with soil health and some sprays to optimize fruit quality. Next slide. Real quick, looking specifically at nickel, I know it's been mentioned a couple of times. Nickel is an important nutrient, often overlooked in many crops. I've seen a lot of nickel deficiency this season in orchards that I've walked. In pecan, it's a very easy one to spot when it's too low. You see that mouse ear occur, and especially in young trees, but also in mature as well. So some key takeaways with this, you really need to get nickel above 2 parts per million. Nickel is incredibly important for the urease enzyme, converting nitrogen within the plant for use. Too much nitrogen in the plant not used can delay maturity, keep the tree green far into the season, and delay some things. So some corrective tools, like I've already mentioned, Elevate and Pulse both have nickel in them, whether you want some P and K in it or just the cobalt moly nickel. CM liquid nickel, then acidifying some fertigation with Nova Pec Acid or pH low. Next slide. So these are kind of looking through some basic, moderate, and advanced programs. I'll just kind of look at the advanced program for time's sake. But something I challenge growers and retailers on alike is many growers, depending on what the crop and even some nuts, they'll update their genetics every so often when a seed company comes out with a new seed for a row crop, or there's a new cultivar for a tree crop. They'll update, their insecticide or herbicide chemistries fairly often, rotate those in. But, sometimes you ask them, like, when was the last time you updated your nutrition? And they say, 20, 30 years ago. What we've been doing works. Well, there are a lot of things that have come out since then, new chemistries, new practices to look into. So looking at that advanced program, they're using polysulphate early in the season, applying it with maybe a dry nitrogen, a dry phos, and pairing it with some soil applied zinc in some way. In season, utilizing a pick acid, Nova Peak, High Peak, whether it be through fertigation or a side dress banding application. Using some Foliar K in there, Uptake K, Nova Finish, Nova Flow, or soil applied K like Nova NK. And then definitely adding in some of those extra micronutrients to the sprays, nickel and manganese, because they're so critical for nutrient use efficiency and some reproductive growth. And then some special things to add in, things like Bio's Diamond, especially with all alone or with some humic for to stimulate roots and microbial activity, enzyme activity in the soil, help with nutrient use efficiency there, maybe help some residue breakdown from harvest trash or shredding trash from hedging. So it's a few things to consider for that production. Next slide. So really kind of some key takeaways here as a focus. Again, soil fertility with Polysulphate PK plus with nutrient use efficiency, Bio's Diamond and humics to activate roots and microbes, micronutrients through our extra line or Nova foliars. These XD things are going to be very potassium heavy, just general potassium management from our Nova K products or even Polysulphate. Stress and disease defense from like a foliar potassium, like an Uptake K or a K-Sal, helping the plant defenses for biotic and abiotic stresses. And then again, closing out the season with some high potassium inputs to improve that maturation. Some fertigation things to consider, as mentioned before, Nova Pick acid, zinc EDTA, or some other form of soil applied zinc, Bio's Diamond. So just kind of a layered season-long approach with using soil and foliar applications to maximize the timing and efficiency.
So as we think through and we kind of do a decision tree to bring it home, some key differences would be, do we have irrigation or not? On the pecans, even though they have flood irrigation, they still try to do a kind of a modified fertigation where they can shank it in and then they can fertigate. So then you can have the advantage of some of the more advanced technologies and increase in your nutrient use efficiency. So if we have it where we can fertigate it on, that's actually the easiest, for us to do. So then if you do, you go to the left, there's, ICL Growing Solutions provides a whole slew of different products and a lot of different choices as far as availability. Nova Pick acid is acidifying. Nova High Peak is one that's a neutral pH that you can utilize for both a foliar or a fertigation base. Pick acid is fertigation based. And, as you saw, a lot of different options that are there. It's just giving some pieces to the puzzle that you could utilize. Overall, it's making sure that you're looking at the key nutrients at the key timing. As I showed you with some of the, if you go back, with Polysulphate, there's a lot that's there from the standpoint of across all orchards. We've seen it in other crops as well. Polysulphate provides an excellent tool for a nutrient use efficiency, gradual uptake, a great tool to be able to utilize for both the agronomic and economic benefits to the orchards. And then if there's foliage still on, then we would look at doing granular fertigation options. And if it's not on, if it is still good foliage, then of course we can think about doing some micronutrient applications or some other foliars that are kind of an NPK or just a PK like a Formula 1. Okay, now next. So we bring it home, whether you're talking about post-harvest, dormant, early spring, really trying to hit on the fact that we need to make sure that we are providing the orchards with what they need to set them up well so that we can have a good nut set, we can have good tree growth. We don't want to get to the point that we have any deficiencies. So how can we test and plan ahead? How can we utilize the research like Dr. Hirama has provided, as well as other research to say what tools are the best to utilize and when. Combining, as we saw, the granular or dry fertilizer like a polysulphate with a fertigation and foliar feeding, so that we have this overall strategy to do for the whole orchard, and layering both the late season and the early season applications together. Okay, next slide. And we will open it up for questions for the team, for anybody that would like.
Yes, thank you so much, Christy, Richard, and Derek. You shared so many great insights and so much helpful data for everyone to consider. If you haven't had a chance to submit your questions, please do so now. We do have a few moments left. You can put them in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to give it just a second. I've got a couple coming in here. In the interest of time, I'll go ahead and get started. So first question, my soil pH is 8.2 and I struggle to get enough phosphorus, potassium, and zinc into my orchard. Should I use a combination of polysulphate dry and Novapec acid fertigated along with my zinc?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and thinking about a way to blend it together. The granular polysulphate provides the P and the K and the calcium and the sulfur, but the additional thing that we have seen with polysulphate is we've actually seen increased root growth and also better nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency, so that would be a help. When we combine the PEC acid with biostimulant, and we can reduce that pH in the root zone with fertigation, then we can be able to almost in some cases double our P and K availability. So in that zone would be really important. And then, as you see with Dr. Hirama, where you put the soil applied zinc in that zone so that it can be taken up by the trees, I think that would be a great combo.
I would add one thing, and this is I maybe Christy and Derek can kind of follow up with this. One potential, it's not truly an incompatibility, but phosphorus and zinc sometimes can actually be antagonistic, right? So excessive, well, in particular, excessive phosphorus, not appropriate amounts, but excessive phosphorus can result in zinc deficiencies. And I'm wondering if that's a concern that's ever been seen with these products.
So one of the beauties of the Novapec acid is actually its compatibility. So it's a good choice. As always, you have to pick and choose different ones and do a compatibility test, but PEC acid actually has a lot of compatibility with a lot of different products, including calcium.
Yeah, and it is, in the plants, or phosphate can cause some induced deficiencies and high rates to those other nutrients, especially zinc. So it is very important to put those out together when you can, or stagger them a little bit, but make sure they're going out around the same time. But yeah, the PEC acid is very, very compatible. Like Christy mentioned, mixing it with calcium in certain situations. I think that, back to the question, I think that'd be a really good combination to apply out there. The PEC acid with zinc EDTA or some other form of soil applied zinc. It'll help get that into plants, and then the PEC acid is really good at also helping release nutrients from the soil, in addition to the efficiencies that it brings in the polysulphate.
Wonderful. Thank you. In the interim, we're going to bring up the QR code to scan with your CCA app on your mobile device for the CEU credit. We are almost out of time. I know that the group will welcome further questions if you'd like to send them to us. I apologize that we went so close to time. I do have one last question here that just popped up. Do chelates like EDTA work better than EDTAs?
I can speak just a moment to that. So that depends a little bit on the metal, that right. So which nutrient you're talking about. So in the case of iron, it's often the case that that iron EDDHA is more available in the soil than iron EDTA. That being said, iron EDDHA is also very expensive, and so there's a cost consideration there as well. But yes, iron EDDHA is more available than EDTA, but that's not the case for zinc. So, Derek, do you have something to add to that?
I would agree to that. I've seen charts showing the EDDHA in iron specifically, extending availability far into the pH range of soils over an EDTA. I'm not familiar with an EDDHA zinc specifically. Um, Not to say there's not one out there. I haven't seen it and what I've looked through.
I
So
have
an
tested
EDTA
I've
zinc would
tested
be.
some others, but not that one. So I
Mhm.
think you're right, Derek.
So an EDTA zinc would be fine, but if you can afford it, an EDDHA iron would be the best bet for iron availability.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Christy, Richard, and Derek, and thank you for everyone for joining us. Also, big thank you to ICL for sponsoring the webinar. Keep an eye out for future webinars from National Nut Grower via our email list and our social media platforms. Again, thank you. We really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day.